Well, good evening, Northern Colorado. My atomic clock says it's 6 o'clock straight up, which means it's time for the weekly NCARC TechNet. I am N0NYY Bart. I am in Evans, Colorado, and I will be your net control tonight for the NCARC TechNet. The purpose of this net is to provide an opportunity to people to ask questions that they've never been clear on, bring up topics for discussion to get input from numerous other hams. There are usually lots of new hams and lots of very experienced hams on the net. So it's a great opportunity, and you don't ever need to be embarrassed to ask a question because you didn't know, because we all have to learn everything somewhere along the way. This is a directed net. All traffic will go through net control. If there's any emergency or priority traffic, you may interrupt the net by saying break or by saying your call sign or even the suffix if you want to be quicker, and we will suspend the net until such time as your emergency traffic has been completed. All amateur radio operators with UHF privileges are invited to participate in the net. Club membership, while always encouraged, is never required. For the purpose of counting participation, there will be no checkout required. When checking in, please give your call sign alphabetically, N0NYY. Give your call sign phonetically. Please use the standard ITU phonetics. November 0, November Yankee Yankee, in my case. Followed by your name and your location. And please do so slowly. Be warned, if you go fast and I have to race to keep up, I will chide you and ask you to slow down. It's not a big deal, but it makes it a lot easier to get through it accurately. And when I hear I will take call signs 3 at a time, and I will read the call signs back. If there is a correction or I missed a letter, feel free to say so. Just say correction, and I will come back to you and we'll get it taken care of. If you tried to check in and you did not hear me acknowledge your call sign in that group of 3, it is likely that you doubled with somebody else and they may have won. So feel free to go ahead and try again. Again, I will take check-ins in groups of 3, and we will start with suffixes alpha through Mike. So if your call suffix begins with A through M, please call net control now.
K0MLG. Sounded like there was a double. Kilo 0 Mike, Lima Golf. Your name? Wellington.
WA9FBO, Whiskey Alpha 9, Foxtrot, Bravo, Oscar, Bob in LaPorte.
W0LEI, Whiskey 0 Lima Echo India, Chad and Stout.
Let's hold there. I would like to acknowledge K0MLG, the designated smart aleck for the evening. Thank you for volunteering, Marty. WA9FBO and W0LEI. Next group of 3, Alpha through Mike, please.
Hey, good evening, Bart and Annette. Kilo India 0, Kilo November. KI0KN. I think I did that backwards how you asked, but James in Loveland.
Good evening, Bart. WE0MH, Whiskey Bravo 0 Mike Hotel, Mike in Loveland.
KF0JQH, Kilo 3, 0 Alpha Delta, George Kent in Wellington.
Let's break there. Had to write the second one down. So we got 4. KI0KN. James, good to hear you on the radio, sir. WB0MH, KF0GQH, Golf Quebec Hotel, Kent, I believe that was, and K3SAD, George. There was a bit of a double there with George and Kent, but I got both of them. All right, next group of 3.
This is N0EMP, November 0, Echo Mike Papa, Greg in Fort Collins with Debbie, K0DBE, Kilo 0, Delta Bravo Echo. No traffic.
This is AE0KO, Alpha Echo 0 Kilo Oscar, Brad in Wellington, no traffic.
All right, we'll break there. I would like to acknowledge N0EMP, K0DBE, and AE0KO. Okay, next group of three, go ahead.
This is KF0PYB, Kilo Foxtrot, 0, oh Lord, sorry, it's been a very long day. Grants in Loveland.
This is KF0 Delta Delta, Paul, Berthoud, no traffic.
W5VV, Whiskey 5, Victor, Bill, and Livermore.
Okay, we'll break there. That would like to acknowledge W5VV, KF0ODD, and Grant. Can I get your suffix again, please?
That is KF0PYB, Kilo Foxtrot 0, Papa Yankee Bravo.
PYB, got it. Thank you. And we all have those days, trust me. Not a problem. Next group of three, go ahead.
This is K0AZA, Kilo 0 Alpha Zulu Alpha, Ron in Fort Collins.
This is AZA, good evening, Ron. Okay, we'll open it up to all suffixes. And in all suffixes, again, we'll try to go three at a time if we can.
This is AE0CF, Alpha Echo 0, Charlie Foxtrot, Ben, Fort Collins.
M0BNK, November 0, Bravo, November Kilo, Rick in the port.
This is WB5TEX, Whiskey Bravo 5, Tango Echo X-Ray, Dale in Loveland.
We'll break there. I would like to acknowledge AE0CF and 0BNK and WB5TEX. I wrote it right. I just can't read it right. Sorry about that, Dale. Next three, go ahead. All right. We'll take a break for a moment, and if there's any stations on Echolink that would like to check in, any stations on Echolink. And for those of you that have not used it, when you use Echolink, you cannot key up until the repeater drops completely. Not just a courtesy beep, but the squelch tail has to drop. Then the Echolink users can go ahead and call in. Any users on Echolink, please call Net Control now. Okay, not hearing any Echolink. Any other check-ins for this evening? And by the way, late check-ins will always be allowed.
This is KB0YDN, Kilo Bravo 0, Yankee Delta November, Eric, Mobile, Loveland.
All right. I would like to acknowledge KB0YDN. Good evening, Eric. Good to hear you there. All right. We will get going along here. Nobody mentioned any topics yet or questions yet on your check-in, which is fine. Does anybody have any topics for the net or questions? Please call now. MH, go.
I have been trying to figure out, looking at the RF exposure calculator, what the meaning is maximum power density, safe distance for controlled and uncontrolled environments. I've seen those numbers, but it doesn't make any sense to me, or worse, to other folks. So if someone can explain that sort of thing in English, I think that would be good. Back to net, WB0MH.
Can.
Go ahead.
I can take a shot at that one, Bart, if that's all right.
By all means. You're probably one of the best guys to do so.
Okay, thanks. And good evening, Mike. So before I get into the controlled, uncontrolled, and what all this means, I want to give you a very quick explanation as to why this all of a sudden surfaced in ham radio when for all these years we didn't have to do it. And the answer, I know it's hard to believe when we're talking about a government agency, but is simplicity. The exposure calculation requirements have been a thing for most FCC licenses for a very long time, but certain services were held to different standards and certain, and to different requirements, and the FCC kind of cleaned up house and said, you know what, everybody's going to do it the same way, and that'll just make it simpler. And that's why we had the change here a couple years back. And to recap what the requirement is that for each of your antennas, you must calculate or measure, and you can do either one, and then keep in a station logbook the numbers for your controlled or uncontrolled exposure limits for each antenna at each band you operate on. So now let's talk about what controlled versus uncontrolled means. It's a very typical and more understood term in both broadcast and land mobile radio. But what controlled means is that you have a way of limiting the general public from wandering closer than X distance to your antenna. And what does that mean? Well, if you were to go to a mountaintop site, if there's a fence around the property that the tower is on, it is likely that outside of that fence is the uncontrolled area, meaning anybody in the general public can come that close and no closer to your transmitting antenna. Conversely, a controlled limit is it's exactly that. You have controlled access to who can come closer to the antenna. And so, again, using our mountaintop radio site or our broadcast antenna, uncontrolled, the distance from that fence to the transmitting antenna would need to be your minimum for uncontrolled exposure limit. And anybody that's got the key to go inside the fence is also supposed to have the training to understand, measure, and protect themselves from the exposure. And so they're allowed to be closer because they are supposedly trained and able to limit their exposure to within an acceptable amount, thus the controlled exposure amount. And that's what, like, the RF meters that we wear when we go climb repeater towers are measuring. So that's the difference between uncontrolled and controlled. Now, as far as exposure goes, you know, for anybody that's new here, one of the things that's important to understand is that RF radiation is called non-ionizing radiation, as opposed to, say, like a nuclear source, which is ionizing radiation. The non-ionizing radiation, such as that comes from any of our radios, is not a cancer threat. It is not, what it is a heating and burn threat. It will actually cause your cells to vibrate, causing against each other, and they will cause enough heat to cause you burns, and you will burn your body. So that's why the limits are different. And for a controlled exposure, you can be exposed to more energy for a shorter amount of time. Basically, you've got to cool off, if you will, in very layman's terms, before you can be in front of it again. And so you will always find two sets of numbers. Uncontrolled, which means anybody that can get within the uncontrolled distance that you have either calculated or measured. If it's in the uncontrolled category, they are safe 24/7. You could camp out right there at that distance with the antenna on 100% of the time, or whatever duty cycle is calculated out as safe in the uncontrolled range, and you never have to worry about exposure. That person could be there indefinitely without getting hurt. And, you know, again, with controlled, you can only be there within the time limits, the exposure limit set for the controlled time base there. And the law says the regulations say we have to either calculate or measure that. That gets very complicated very fast. There are E-plane and H-plane measurements. You know, there are electromagnetic and magnetic fields and all this. by far, the absolute easiest thing to do is to go to the ARRL. They've got a very nice little exposure calculator. And for your antenna, you put in the specifics on your power, your bands, the gain of the antenna, and it will tell you right then and there what your controlled and uncontrolled exposure distances are from the antenna. That was a huge bunch of mouthfuls, so Mike, let me send it back to you first to see if that makes sense or you have further questions.
Well, that makes a whole lot more sense. And the other question I had, right along with that, going through the charts that I made, the lower the frequency, the closer you can be to the antenna. The minimum safe distance decreases with wavelength increase. Is that because of the wavelength increase, the RFI, or what is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, those distances change based on how different frequencies affect our bodies. And I'm going to be embarrassed if I get this one wrong, but if I'm remembering the test question right from the technician class, I believe the most restrictive category of frequencies for us are 30 to 300 megahertz. And in that range, that's why you'll find the distances need to be the greatest, and that is because those frequencies cause the most heating. Our cells vibrate better at those frequencies. At the lower frequencies, your cells are not vibrating against each other anywhere near as fast as they are at the higher frequencies. And so that's why, as the frequency goes down, you are allowed to be closer to the antenna. It's simply the physics of how those invisible sine waves react with our cells.
Okay, so for instance, 10 meters, my screwdriver at 1.5 dB gain, which I think is I think it's a lot less than that, but it says the minimum safe distance is 8.2 feet. So away from the antenna, anything outside of that area is in a safe distance. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah. Well, yes, exactly. I'm assuming you're calculating uncontrolled at that, and that's what it probably sounds like. And so if you're further than 8 feet, you can be there indefinitely at the power level and duty cycle that you calculated, as long as that's what's coming off the antenna, and you are completely safe and risk no damage to your body from being in that field.
Okay, now that makes a lot more sense, because I know that especially microwave ovens, for example, have the doors RF shielded and that sort of thing, but they create a lot more power, like 1,200 watts or something like that of cooking power, and that is enough to cause some real damage. However, like radar units, even like in gigahertz range for multiplexing transmissions back and forth, you don't even want to be anywhere near the waveguides, even though it's just at 1 watt, because it can create that much damage in such a real short time.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, if you think about, it is a bit of a misnomer to say that it stops being, as much of a problem on our bodies at 300 megahertz, because you're exactly right. If you look at the microwave links that our club uses to build the IP backbone between all of our repeaters, most of those are they're about 5.9 gigahertz at 2 watts, but it's into a 30 dB gain dish. If you do the numbers on that, you'll find that you don't want to be in front of that antenna very long either. It's very, very impactful. But you got it. Microwave, of course, the wavelength is really, really small, so it vibrates our cells very, very fast, generating more heat. It's kind of weird to think about our body as being, cells having friction on each other, but that's really the threat to being in these RF fields.
Okay, that makes a whole lot of sense. And James, I thank you very much. I think this was very informative, and for everybody else involved. So I'll go back in the woodwork. Again, thank you, and made a lot of good sense. With that, back to you, and then back to Bart. So KI0KN, WB0MH.
I'm glad to be informative on the subject there, Mike, and good to talk to you. Before we leave that subject, I want to make sure, I don't know if Mr. Schmidt or anybody else would like to make any comments or have any additional questions on that topic before we leave that one, because that is one that seems to cause a lot of, it came out and there wasn't a lot behind it to explain it when the rulemaking was changed. This is KI0KN. Anybody else want comments or questions?
I read the article in QST, James, and I got exactly the same take on it that you did. So good explanation, WA9FBO.
I was just madly Googling through to find a SAR chart, specific absorption rate. I do recall hearing numerous discussions that one of the most fragile components of our body that we may run into issues with is the gelatin contained in your eyeball. If it gets heated up, and it gets heated up moderately easily, it becomes cloudy and will do permanent damage to your vision. You can't go have that fluid changed like you can the oil in your engine. My recollection, and I'm going to say I'm about 60% sure on this, was that in the 300 to 500 megahertz range, we were most sensitive. That's where the eyeballs in the brain would absorb the most energy, so the SAR limits were the lowest. It was once upon a time said that if you had a quarter wave 440 antenna on your baseball cap and 10 watts going into it, you were at risk. There's a reason why most HTs were limited to 5 watts, and it may have stemmed back to some of that information. James, do you have handy access to the specific frequency versus SAR, so we could pin down where the frequencies where we are most sensitive?
W0LEV, please.
W0LEV. I'm checking you in here, Dave. And go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be in and out because I'm doing supper, but monitoring in the kitchen. Run the numbers for your HT. I won't tell you what the results are going to be, but run the numbers for your HT based on the ARRL or even the RSGB stuff. Enough said on that. And yep, eyeballs and, male reproductive organs. That's why they do not recommend you carry your cell phone on in your pocket, at least for men. Enough said, and I need to go back to the kitchen. W0LEV.
EMP.
EMP, go ahead.
Yeah, I read somewhere at some point that a 6-foot-tall person, their whole body absorption peaks around 70 megahertz because they're about a half-wave dipole. If they're 6 foot tall, they're about a half-wave dipole at 70 megahertz, which is not a U.S. amateur band, but it is in some other countries, like I think England has what they call the 4-meter band is 70 megahertz. The human head is resonant around 70 centimeters, which is one of our bands, and the human eyeball is resonant about 2.4 gigahertz. And like James said, with the eyeball, there's no blood flow through that vitreous humor, which is the fluid in the eyeball itself. There's no blood flow going through there. There is back in the retina, but not through the bulk of the eyeball. And there's also no blood flow going through the cornea. So those don't get actively cooled by circulating blood, so they're even more vulnerable. And 0 EMP.
YDN.
YDN, go ahead.
I have a question and a comment, and the question is more kind of on a technical, or not technical, but a legal technicality. Just as fences can be hopped, towers can be climbed. They're not supposed to be, but they can be. So is a tower considered a controlled space if it does not have a fence around it?
There are typically warning signs, no trespassing signs, and RF warning signs on commercial towers and on the gates around perimeter fences at commercial sites, and 0 EMP.
There is also there were some court rulings way long time ago. I read a few of these that said if you have made make sure I have it, if you have made a reasonable effort. Well, that's just real specific, isn't it? So there are panels you can put on your tower that swing out and swing in and padlock. And if you have put those on your tower, you have made a reasonable effort to prevent somebody climbing it. If somebody is dumb enough to put a ladder over the top of your panel and climb up while you're transmitting, well, that kind of sort of falls back on them. So the warnings help, and the reasonable effort thing that I have read about in the past, it's not common in my understanding, with the exception of the ends of, say, an inverted V, which are not very high off the ground. It is not common to find places where you are likely to be injured by the RF level. That's a pretty, I guess that's a little bit of a bold statement there. But if you've got a beam antenna up at the top of your tower, unless you're radiating way above legal power, and your tower is extremely short, chances are from HF you're not going to see any issues. When you start getting up into the VHF, UHF, including 6 meters, then you need to pay a lot closer attention and see what the specific absorption rates are. And I'm still madly searching for a graph that I have seen, and I'm not able to find it so far. If I find it, I'll email it to Greg or Joe or somebody, and we'll try to get it up on the website.
Also a comment, YDN.
Go ahead, Eric.
Of course you can change the fluid in your eyeball. They call that cataract surgery. I know I am destined to have it eventually, probably because of RF exposure, as a matter of fact. I had my arm wrapped around a 900 megahertz trunking system's antenna for support without realizing it for probably a few seconds too long. KB0YDN, back to that.
My understanding of cataracts is that they are more in the lens itself, that they can't take that fluid out and put it back. I do not believe. Yep, okay, so I'm still researching and trying to find that. I'm not going to say any more about it until I actually can pin down these numbers. Again, James, thank you. That was an excellent explanation there. Any other questions or comments on specific exposure rates in that?
Dumb comment, YDN.
Wait a minute, I thought Marty was the designated smart aleck tonight. I'm just kidding. Go ahead, Eric.
As part of cataract surgery, they do drain your eyeball, and they replace it with saline. And the saline eventually is replaced with vitreous humor. The time between the two, between the time that you are given the saline and the time that you have vitreous, you're effectively blind in that one eye. So that's why I do an eye at a time. Like I said earlier, this is of concern to me because I have to have it done. KB0YDN, back to that.
EV again.
LED, go ahead.
Yep, they use a saline solution to clean it after they have removed the lens. I've had both eyes done. I was never blind. I well remember looking through the orifice of the eye without a lens. It was kind of jagged. But no, you're never really blind during a cataract replacement, and it is strictly lens. And no, they do not touch the vitreous humor. One last comment, I hope it's last. The cranial cavity filled with the neural makeup of the brain resonates at 450 megahertz. And the second harmonic, that's the first eigen function of half wave. The full wave, glory be, is 900 megahertz, are just a tad above the cell phone frequency. You won't find much published in this country about it, but over in Europe there's all kinds of published papers, published studies about the damage to the inner ear and in some cases even the brain because of that resonance. And of course 450 are HTs. 900 megahertz is everywhere these days. So those are, well, okay. I'll go back to the kitchen and try not to pick up the mic again. Double get 0LEV.
And 0NYY net control for this evening's NCARC TechNet. Okay, any other questions on the RF energy and specific absorption rates?
Hey, CF.
CF, go ahead.
Were there any studies on duty cycle and cool down period? Like if you were exposed for this many seconds, you need to let it cool down for this much before you should be exposed to the radiation or RF before it will cause more damage. Because I imagine that a lot of these things, they will cause things to heat up, but they're not instantaneous heat up, but they will, I mean, if you turn off the RF, it will start cooling down. It might not be as much of a problem anymore. This is easier stuff.
EMP.
Go ahead, Greg.
It was a while ago that I used the ARRL calculator, but I think that it was by band and mode and duty cycle as far as, talk versus listen time. So I think the ARRL utility had factored all that in.
Okay, that sounds good. Also, and then the other thing is the cool down. I don't know, it sounds like you probably don't have that in account, but, this is the easier to factor in.
Very good question, Ben, and good to hear you this evening, too. I do recall that there were two different groups of regulations. There's a group of scientists that have calculated out the SARs, and then there's the ARRL requirements, which are probably 50% or less of the exposure levels that were originally designed. There's definitely a built-in safety margin there with the ARRL. I haven't seen where they go so far as to talk about the duty cycle of that exposure, but how do you control that? And why do you get that close to an antenna anyway? It's mostly for protection. I don't think most of us would deliberately get that close to an antenna that we knew was transmitting, but it would be really good to know what the numbers are. If you've got a kilowatt on 440, you have a very high-risk situation, especially if it's combined with a Leinster beam. So there's guidelines out there to allow you to go by and allow you to try to be safe. And again, the ARRL guidelines are safer than the other guidelines that I have seen published by the government. Okay, do we have any other evening or Chris. I have a question. Is there anyone that has a 440 beam? Chet was asking if someone might have one that he could borrow for the weekend. He didn't tell me how many elements. I didn't get any further information or what it was going to be used for. So I'm going to say, does anyone have a portable 440 beam that they would be willing to let him use for this weekend? Please call net control now.
BMK?
Go ahead, Rick.
I happen to have one. Not being used right now. It's just sitting in my shed.
Can you give me a little data on it? How many elements, etc.?
I think it's a 4-element. It's got a full dipole on it. PVC boom, and it has a place where you can plug I believe a 3/4 inch piece of pipe up into a T, and fasten it down somehow. And anyway, yeah, I've got one. It works.
If I pass your information along to Chet in case you do astray. KN0NYY. Is it okay with you if I pass your number along to Chet?
I see this.
You're breaking up a little bit there, Rick. Something happened?
Yeah, I'm moving right now. And I'm using an HT and a speaker mic, so maybe give me a little bit, and we'll do this again when I get in a better place. N0BNK.
Okay, I can just call you on the phone and ask you my question too. That will be just fine. All right. Any other topics or questions for the net before we shut down this evening?
W0CDN testing.
Station testing. Go again. Your audio was a little bit light.
Hey, Bart, this is W0CDN, Christian Norris. I just wanted to put a call out, let people know that we are doing the Courage Classic this weekend, and we're still in need of hands, so if you guys got some time this weekend and want to go spend some time in the mountains, let me know.
Yeah, Copper Mountain, if I'm not mistaken. It's a wonderful place to go do ham radio. Is there anybody this evening that would be interested in helping Chris out with the Courage Classic? I know Chris will keep putting the word out, though.
Appreciate it. I think it's just going to be one of those years. W0CDN.
7:30, good to hear you. By the way, get on the radio once in a while. All right, I'm going to check you in anyway, whether you like it or not, too. So that gives us 20 check-ins for the evening. That's pretty good. Am I on there? I'm not. We have 21 because I'm here, too. And Jean is here, and I didn't check her in. M0QXQ, Jean in Greeley. All right, 22. Oh, stop. 22 check-ins for the evening, and I'm going to call it at 6:45. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. And don't forget, we do this every single week. And it's great to have people here and bring your questions, and you see what happens. There are people out there with answers. 731 and all, and 0NYY closing the net.
This presentation was brought to you by the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club. For more information, visit our website, ncarc.net. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.